Thank you very much. I am a writer, a scribbler, a mere sojourner in the epiphenomena of the everyday, as Henry James, one of my idols, might say. And as such, I find I have a more verbal than visual imagination. And I tried to think of ways, audio-visually, to illustrate the sin of envy, which is my subject today. And I really couldn't think of any. And the only audio-visual aids I've brought are my voice and my eyes. What I've done instead is prepare a little text on the anatomy and history of envy in very brief compass. And if you'll go along with me, I'd like to read it to you now. Thank you for this chair, La Ciudad. As a writer, both of stories and essays, nothing interests me so much as human nature. In the end, I have come to conclude, for writers, human nature is the major, perhaps the only subject. Closely connected to human nature is the matter, perhaps I should say the question, of sin. Are we as human beings naturally sinful, or might sin be honed out of us by religion, by science, by one or another kind of therapy, or by, God forbid, brute totalitarian politics? Now, I claim no expertise on the subject of sin, along with being a minor practitioner of the normal human sins. I happen to have written a little book, one of fewer than 50,000 words, on the subject of envy, one of the 7 deadly sins, first formulated by Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century. Wrath, envy, gluttony, greed, lust, pride, and sloth. These constitute the full roster of the 7 deadly sins. Each of these sins is not alone an act against religion, which is to say against God, but also an act against society. To be wrathful or gluttonous or greedy or lusty or prideful or slothful, each in its own way, causes one to sheer off from the norms required by a reasonably well-functioning society. Now, a number of the deadly sins are currently thought to be correctable by means of one or another form of psychotherapy. I do not vouch for the efficacy of these therapies, about which a sensible person is surely allowed his doubts, but merely note that we now have treatments available called anger management to eliminate wrath, Weight Watchers and Jenny Craig to undo gluttony, sex addiction therapy to calm lust, various pharmaceutical remedies to light the fires under sloth, and so on. No one, though, as far as I know, has come up with a therapeutic cure for envy. 6 of the deadly sins of the 7 sins represent a letting go, a form of release, an act of giving way. However harmful they may be to others, they represent pleasure of a sort to the sinner himself. Envy, alas, is the only one of the 7 sins that is no fun at all, not the least bit. The French novelist Balzac called envy that ignoble accumulation of disappointed hopes, frustrated talents, failures, and wounded pretensions. Envy also interpenetrates the other 6 sins. Greed often begins in envy. Envy certainly figures in gluttony and lust. Envy is a division of anger, though of the hidden, smoldering kind. And pride and envy seem inextricable, with envy often loosing pride onto the world. Thank you for that. Socrates, you may recall, held that all virtue is one. Might the same be said of sin? Envy also has pride of sin in being the oldest of the 7 deadly sins, pride of place. The murder of Abel by his brother Cain was a crime with the sin of envy as its motive. The Old Testament is, of course, replete with stories of envy. So too Shakespeare, whose subtlest villain, Iago from Othello, is only comprehensible when ascribing envy to the character. Iago's envy it is that ignites Othello's jealousy, which brings apart the play's tragedy. Now, envy differs from jealousy. Jealousy, wrote La Rochefoucauld, is in a way just and reasonable because its aim is merely to retain something that belongs to us or that we think belongs to us, whereas envy is a frenzy that cannot endure the fact that other people possess anything. Broadly speaking, what we find to envy in others is what we take to be their good fortune. This good fortune might include their possession of wealth, beauty or power, lovers, learning, athletic or other prowess, and anything that brings them luxury, comfort, pleasure, enhanced status. Envy, please note, is also a close cousin to snobbery. When seemingly arbitrary misfortune befalls most of us, the first question asked is, why me? But to the person afflicted by envy, when in the company of those whom life appears to have treated more graciously, the first questions are, why him or her? Why not me? For the vast most part, nothing is done to rectify the injustice felt by envy, by the envious. They are unlikely to be able to do much about redistributing fortune so that it favors themselves. All that is left to the envious, really, is the hope that the envied person meets with misfortune, that, in one way or another, his gifts do not spare him from failure, preferably of a resounding, public, and painful kind. All that the person suffering from envy can fall back on finally is schadenfreude. Schadenfreude, that not very pretty German word denoting an even slightly uglier emotion in simple envy, the emotion of delight at the defeat of those we envy. Schadenfreude is envy satisfied. Schopenhauer thought that human beings were at their lowest when feeling schadenfreude. Schadenfreude, he held, takes the place which pity ought to take. Today we would say it places antipathy where sympathy should be. Now, the French theorist Alexis de Tocqueville wrote that democratic institutions most successfully develop sentiments of envy in the human heart. Envy is a would-be leveling mechanism. Nietzsche thought the French and just about every other revolution was stoked by envy. As greed is felt to be the reigning emotion of capitalism, envy is felt to be that behind socialism, though in capitalist societies, advertising does what it can to help stir up envy. Envy is not easily susceptible to scientific study or even therapeutic cure. The psychoanalyst Leslie Farber remarked that, quote, envy by its very nature is obstinate in its opposition to investigation, adding that its protean character and its talent for disguise probably account for the infrequency of studies of the subject. La Rochefoucauld, writing 3 centuries earlier, supports this, writing, we often pride ourselves on our passions, even the most criminal ones, but envy is a timid, shamefaced passion which we never dare to acknowledge. Envy, in other words, is not merely a deadly, but also a secret sin which we cannot admit even to ourselves. Envy comes in national styles. Kierkegaard thought Norwegians a notably envious people, but then he was himself Norwegian. He felt, too, that envy was more intense in villages and small towns than in large cities. The ancient Greeks worried not only about incurring the envy of the gods, but built an outlet for envy into some of their political institutions. Ostracism was such an institution. Everyone here will recall that the Greeks ostracized their great leader, Aristides the Just, because, according to Plutarch, Athenian citizens grew tired of always hearing him called the Just. Now, if the United States sometimes seems the most hated country in the world, is envy of its good fortune, represented by prosperity and power, the driving force behind such hatred? The emotional leitmotifs of anti-Americanism, the political analyst Timothy Garton Ash wrote, are resentment mixed with envy. Might the long history of anti-Semitism be driven by envy? Have the Jews been historically despised not for their reputed exclusiveness, their purported chosenness, but because, under the greatest historical pressures, they seem to have survived and in many instances flourished intellectually, financially, artistically. Is Islamic fundamentalism of the kind that takes the form of terrorism inspired quite as much by envy as by intense religious feeling? Was 9/11 at bottom an act of supreme envy? What makes it also a complex act is the element in it, and in so many other acts of Islamic terrorism, of suicide. Wittgenstein thought suicide the fundamental sin. If suicide is allowed, then everything is allowed, he wrote in his notebooks of 1914-16. If anything is not allowed, then suicide is not allowed. Suicide, Wittgenstein felt, is, so to speak, the elementary sin. Now, the ultimate sin for Wittgenstein turns out to be the ultimate act of virtue for jihadists, which suggests that perhaps sin, too, might be culturally relative. Does the Arab world, confronted with the commercial and agricultural and technological success of Israel, hate the Israeli people less for religious and historical reasons than out of envy for their tiny nation's success? My larger point here is that the role of envy in geopolitics can scarcely be overrated, and not alone in the Middle East. Whence does envy derive? What purpose does it serve? Who, if anyone, needs it? If envy is a disease of the soul, is a cure for it possible? Why are human beings afflicted with this dark and unrewarding emotion? Is envy, finally, inextricably part of human nature? As with all the most interesting questions, neither do we finally have satisfactory answers to these questions about the relations of envy to human nature. Now, I'd like to take just 1 second longer to say that there are very few jokes about envy. There are a great many about all the other 6 of the others of 7 deadly sins, but of envy, it's very hard to find a joke. And the only one that I know of that has some quality is about the 3 men, an Englishman, a Frenchman, and a Russian, walking on the beach, where between them they find a bottle. Lo, they open with a cork, they open the bottle, and it will not surprise you to know that a genie pops out. The genie says to them, usually I give 3 wishes to the person who releases me from the bottle, but since there are 3 of you, I'll give each one of you a wish. He turns to the Englishman first and says, what is your wish? The Englishman says, well, you know, my dear friend Clive has a lovely cottage in the Cotswolds. I would like a cottage like Clive's, you see, but unlike Clive's, I'd like it to have 2 more bedrooms. I'd like the garden to be a little larger, and where the brook by Clive's cottage just has perch, I would like mine to have both bass and trout. Very well, the genie says, and there it is. He turns to the Frenchman and says, yours next. Frenchman says, well, you know, my friend Pierre, my dear friend Pierre, has a mistress, a very striking, tall, beautiful woman, a redhead. I would like a mistress like Pierre's, you see, but unlike Pierre's mistress, I would like mine to be rather more slender. I would like her to be blonde with blue eyes, or, and one thing more, I would like her to have attended the École Normale Supérieure. Puff, it's done. Turns now, the genie does, to the Russian, and he says, now it is your wish. He says, I live in Kishinev. Outside my house, there is a farm owned by my friend Ivan. Ivan has this cow, a remarkable cow. It gives vast quantities of milk, which make the richest cream, the purest butter. I want that cow killed. That's envy. Thank you so much for your attention.
Bravo.
Thank you.